to Limelight Arts Travel's podcast, A Closer Look. Inside the small Gothic Loggia del Bigallo in Florence, directly across from the far better known baptistery and cathedral, lies one of the earliest representations of the city in art. It's part of a much larger fresco known as the Madonna of Mercy, that shows a monumental Virgin Mary venerated by men and women gathering around her. These people could almost be stand-ins for members of a lay confraternity that met in the Loggia del Bigallo, praying, listening to sermons, and planning the charitable activities that they would undertake in the medieval city we see beneath them. In this episode, historian Dr Nick Eckstein joins Limelight's Dr Nick Gordon to take us inside the loggia, but also inside the city and the mentality of its inhabitants.
Well, welcome, Nick, and thanks for joining us today on our podcast.
Nice to be here, Nick.
And today we're talking about an image that people are probably less familiar with in Florence. But do you mind telling us about where we are in Florence?
I think that's an excellent way to begin, for reasons that I hope will become apparent. So we can imagine that we are standing on the Piazza Duomo in the middle of Florence. So we're standing, let's say, just between the baptistery, which is opposite the main portal of the cathedral, so you can see Giotto's great bell tower. And if we turn towards the southern entrance to the piazza, we can see on the corner of the Via Calzaioli, which leads away from the piazza, a beautiful Gothic building, a 14th and 15th century building, known today as the Loggia del Bigallo. Bigallo, B-I-G-A-L-L-O. Now, what's the Bigallo? The Bigallo is a confraternity, which is a religious society of lay people that congregate together for group prayer and often to do charitable works. This one was founded in 1244 by a Dominican friar whose name is St. Peter Martyr. It has the imprimatur of the Florentine government as well. And this place, in which is the image that we're going to talk about, is a charitable ospedale is the word they would use, hospital, but that really means more of a shelter for the sick and for abandoned children and so on. It's a place that runs religious processions and ceremonies in the city. It's also important for plague relief. Initially, the Bigallo is part of another confraternity, a very famous one called the Compagnia della Misericordia. That is the company, that's their generic name. A confraternity is called the Company of Mercy. Misericordia means mercy, of course. And that's a similar society to the Bigallo, which focused on aiding sick people, burying the dead. Now, those societies actually part ways in 1425, but before that, they're kind of involved with each other. So, as I say, these confraternities in the 14th century are linked. They're on the Piazza del Duomo. And by the middle of the 14th century, the Bigallo is operating out of this loggia that we're about to walk into. So if we walk into the building through the facade, which is by a contemporary designer called Alberto Arnoldi, we'll notice that we've got reliefs and statues, propagating themes of charity, mercy, and so on. Those are the images we're seeing on the facade as we walk in. Across the way, by the way, because we're there today, aren't we? If we're visiting in our mind's eye, we're in the 21st century. If we look just across the way as we walk in, we'll see probably a modern ambulance standing outside another building. That's where the Misericordia went when they split up. The Misericordia, do you remember I said, was actually about very interested in plague relief, hospital functions, and so on. It still is the organisation in most Italian cities that runs the ambulance service and does paramedical care. So if you break your leg, God, heaven forbid, anywhere in Florence or any other Italian city, and you call an ambulance, it will be the volunteers, they're still unpaid, young people, volunteers who will come in an ambulance with Misericordia written on the side, and they will be the ones who take you to hospital. It's a medieval tradition alive to this very day, and in Florence, there it is, just across the way, several steps away from the Bigallo. So we're going to walk into this loggia, and I think I need to explain what a loggia is. A loggia is an open arcade If you want, it provides shelter. So if it rains, you step under the arcade of the loggia, which will have, in this case, rounded arches, and you can walk along under cover. If you're in Bologna, most of the major thoroughfares, as you know, have arcades up and down either side. These are loggias as well. So they're semi-open, semi-public, and this is really, really important. At the Bigallo, we will get to the image, I promise you. At the Bigallo di Loggia, this open space under shelter is where you can bring foundlings. So if you're a mother who's having trouble, you can leave your infant, or if people find children in need of help, or poor children in general, they can be brought here. The poor often congregate here. They can seek alms and assistance from the members of the Misericordia and from the Bigallo in this period. I've already said what a confraternity is. So these lay Christians who congregate together are waiting for them, as it were. This is a headquarters as well. If you walk in this period, you can't do this anymore because the building has changed. But if you walk into that loggia in the 14th century and you look towards the end, you see a stunning, very large image of the Madonna, of the Virgin Mary. And so I'll describe what you're looking at. And the point of mentioning all of this about the setting is you're still half on the street in this period. You can turn around, you can hear people going by, you can reach out and touch a pedestrian, but you're kind of inside and you're looking towards the end of the loggia, which is under shelter, and there you see this giant Madonna. Larger than life size. She's framed by biblical texts and mottos and catechetical style quotations, which are mainly to do with the charitable life, about being a good Christian. So today, when you go and see she's in a small interior room, so you've got to remember you're in an entrance hall if you're in the period which opens directly on the piazza. You'll notice, apart from the Gothic filigree work and the decorative motifs and so on, that from about she's got a very long body. She's not tremendously lifelike. But I'm looking at her as we speak, and she's exceptionally tall. So there are all sorts of things going on that are hidden by that mantle. But what you see is that there are praying men and women on each side. Everybody's got their hands raised in prayer and veneration. They're all looking upwards affectionately towards the Madonna. If you look at the expressions of the people, they all have a kind of beatific, grateful, admiring expression on their faces. There are many smiles. The eyes are shining. If I look to my right, that is her left, the expressions on some of the women on the faces are joyful. This is because of her presence, and they're all looking upwards, praying to her, venerating her. They're all dressed in rather well-heeled kinds of costumes, you may say. You're not seeing poor people here. They're tonsured monks and priests and so on. Mainly they're well-to-do Florentine bourgeois, we might say. So everybody is admiring her. There's a message here, which we'll talk about in a moment. And underneath the Madonna is the most intriguing vision of the 14th century, one of the very earliest depictions of the city. And we're talking about the old city. Florence has expanded way beyond its old walls today. But we're looking at the part of the city that was extant at the time, which is mainly north of the river, and it's more or less in the area just to the north of the cathedral, extending down towards the river Arno. So it's the old city. We'll talk about what's there at the moment, but you can see lots of tall buildings jammed in together. This is not a 15th century image where all of the perspective is, inverted commas, correct. This is the depiction of a Christian city. If we look at that detail, we will find an inscription there. I don't know if people prefer their classical or their Italianate pronunciation of Latin, so I'll just go with the Italianate. Civitas Florentinae. That means one can translate that as the city or the the civic culture of Florence, but it's got two meanings. It's referring on one level to the city itself. You can talk about the city of stone, if you like. So it refers to the city as an architectural phenomenon. It also refers to the city of bodies or flesh, that is, the people who live in it. And communitas has much more significance for our present purposes in that context. This is the setting for a community of Christians. And as if we needed emphasis for this, there are all of those worshippers gathering around the Madonna, whom I described a moment ago. It expresses something fundamental about living in that space, which is something you were driving at with your question. Buildings are crowded up against each other because it's a crowded environment. It's no accident that there is no word for privacy in the Italian language, that they use the English word. It's a loan word. They refer to la privacy when they want to talk about privacy. The cute way of describing this is because there isn't any. If you live in an Italian city in this period, you could argue to this day, you may love your neighbours, you may dislike your neighbours. Either way, there's no getting away from your neighbours, so your everyday life is lived in the company of people all around you. So there is something very elemental about that vision of the city that's being communicated there. And as I say that, I'm looking at the row of dark windows, that I'm running my eye across windows and realizing the windows continue across different buildings. I'm almost not noticing one building blending into another. I'm just following windows from one side to the other. So you get this almost poetic sense of what it is like to live in the crowded environment, cheek by jowl with your friends, your relatives, your neighbours, your enemies, the people you can't stand on the street with whom you see every day, the people who are your neighbours who are also your shopkeepers. If you go shopping in this period, and until very, very recently, and still in many places in Italy, you don't have to move very far from your front door because everything you need is, by and large, within a few steps of your house. So there's that. One other thing you will notice by looking there is that there is one outsized building, and remember we've just walked off the piazza, and maybe you're thinking, oh, there's the baptistery that I turned my back on to walk in the front door here. Indeed, the baptistery, which in every Italian city is its own church consecrated to St. John the Baptist, makes sense. St. John the Baptist is always the patron saint of the city baptistery. So San Giovanni Battista, there is the baptistery foremost in the front of that vision. So there is a building with enormous religious significance, and because it matters, it's drawn larger than the life. That has to be said. Baptistry is a big building, but it's very, very prominent, and it's not there because it's accurately depicted in mathematical proportion. It's there it's there prominently because it's important. It's big because it's important.
And I'm just thinking too, as a place where citizens would be baptized and become both Christian and citizen at the same time.
Exactly
right. The prominence of the baptistry surrounding the city surrounded in how it's depicted here by the faithful, with the Madonna hanging over it. There's a theme.
That's right.
You're drawing together here about how a medieval or Renaissance community understood how joined together as a community in a sense.
Exactly right. And what you're talking about is the coalescence of social relations. So your godfather, the people who officiate at your baptism as a child and who are there as well-wishers, your friends, your relatives, your neighbours, your patrons. Your birth and your entry into the society is a collective effort. You're always part of a group. And so you can actually conceive the city as an array of interlocking networks of friends, relatives, and neighbours that just reproduce themselves across the space of the city. So that's another dimension, quite right. There is very little to no distinction between one's existence as a Christian and as a citizen of the city. In another one of the episodes that I've recorded with you, Nick, I've talked about the way in which your every waking moment in the society, in a very real sense, is conceived of as a performance of Christian virtues, that you do charity, that you help the least among you. Of course, people in that period, as in ours, try to be good people and constantly fail and try again. But that whole attempt, that lifelong idea of being a good Christian, of praying, of performing works of charity, which are their own form of prayer in this period, those are all part and parcel of being a good and honourable citizen. They are two sides of the same coin. You can't be a good citizen without being a charitable Christian. So that is showing the setting for that kind of action. But the setting is not just a backdrop. It is an active participant itself, in that the setting and the actions performed within that setting are part of a continuum, if you like.
We're seeing the acts of charity. We're seeing the acts of charity being performed.
Well,
we're seeing acts of contemplation as well being performed in the space that those actions would have been performed.
Yeah, we could certainly do an exegesis of every little medallion on the mantle of the Virgin, and we'll find those messages preached and propounded again and again, just to draw attention to the inscription either side of the Madonna's head. You can see there in contemporary Gothic script an excerpt which on its own is a little bit difficult to interpret because it's been taken out of the larger context. But it comes from Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46, which will be familiar to people, especially those who attend church. And I'll read that little segment because it's the larger message encapsulated in that excerpt, either side of her head. And it goes, "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you made me welcome. Naked, and you clothed me. Sick, and you visited me. In prison, and you came to see me." So there's a sermon there, as in so many of these paintings. They are theatrical tableau, if you like, and they are literally, not metaphorically, they are literally sermons. And there you've got the text which tells those worshipful bourgeois who are gathered around the Madonna that if you want to be good Christians, if you want to speed your own way into the afterlife when you die, then you will help the poor around you, because the other part of that quotation, as people may be aware, is that Christ likens himself to the pauper. So when you refuse help to a person in need, you are refusing Jesus himself. That is the larger message of that scripture from Matthew, and there it is, part and parcel of the Madonna. If I can say one more thing about the figure of the Madonna who stands over that image of the city, her mantle, which is often extended, it's not here, she's got her hands in prayer in front of her breast there. Often these kinds of images, these Madonnas of Mercy as they're called, show her with her mantle drawn apart around the worshipful. And there you've got an even more powerful idea of the Virgin Mary as a kind of spiritual patron. St. John the Baptist is the major patron saint of Florence, but the Virgin Mary is almost equally important. She is a protectress. She is somebody who, in return for the veneration of the Florentine populace, accords her her affectionate protection to the populace at large. And so the Madonna, those biblical messages, the populace, and the city in which all of them live are intimately interwoven in an image like that, which is, as I'm saying, is its own sermon. I'd add one thing, that in many cases, when people go to view these images in the period, so when I'm talking about the 14th century, they will know a lot of the images. There's a lot more literacy in this country, in this period, than people assume. You're not simply functionally illiterate because you're poor. That's an overgeneralization. So these are not just Bibles for the poor, if you like. You're not reading images simply because you're illiterate. Everybody uses images in this way, rich and poor. And when you go to a place like this and look at an image such as this, you will have an instructor with you, very likely. It might be a priest, or it might be an educated person from the confraternity, and they will expound what's going on in the image to you so that they will mediate the message, again, as I've said in my other discussion with Kathleen Olive about the Brancacci Chapel, these are sermons, but you can also think of them as places you went where you were accompanied by a kind of medieval tourist guide who might have been the local priest. And they would have explained these things, much of which you knew, but it's a way of re-emphasizing all of those familiar messages to people who went. So you wouldn't be on your own. You would actually have been instructed very often when you're in front of an image.
And just thinking about just looking at the image and noticing how that grouping of the people around the outside of the Madonna, around the outside of the city, and all of those repeated vertical forms are also echoed in the city itself. So even if they're not underneath the Madonna's cloak, they know that that's their city, that's where they live. They would perhaps be understanding themselves to be under her cloak, even though they're kind of visually depicted outside. There's an interesting kind of visual link that if you were a Florentine looking at this, you would know where you were standing inside the map, and the baptistry also helps you do that. You kind of, you are here and kind of where surrounding people are too. But it's also thinking that from that sense of kind of gathering together, that sense of common action and the common protection, all of these social interactions that you're describing that are kind of informing the image. And just brings me back to a point that you were making near the beginning of this episode about the different roles that the confraternities were playing. And it'll probably surprise people to think that the same group of people are performing acts of charity in looking after the poor, looking after the sick, looking after the injured, also are responsible for undertaking processions in the city. I was just wondering, as a way of moving towards a conclusion, would there be kind of something significant in that relationship, say, between social welfare, public health, and the religious life of lay people in the city?
Absolutely. I find myself making a couple of the points. I've referred a couple of times to that other discussion I've had with Kathleen about the Brancacci Chapel, because in a certain way there's quite a lot of overlap. But one of the things I was saying there applies here as well. That idea of everyday life being a kind of performance, and I would say a theatrical performance. And before we regard this as exotic and other, before we think, oh, this is not like our lives, I'm describing a period, I'm describing a culture in which you have a very powerful sense of where you belong and what your purpose is. I think we find that question more difficult to answer. If we ask why we are here, I think we have a harder time explaining that in the 21st century than these people who would have unhesitatingly said that their purpose is to live the lives of a good Christian in the interest of the afterlife, and that there's a transactional benefit to doing the right thing in terms of the poor, because while you're helping people, certainly, you're also storing up a stockpile of goodwill and virtuous acts that mean that you will go to heaven when you die. So there is that common interest as well. You can see a kind of theatrical representation of all of those ideas in this image, both in the representation of a city. People would have looked at that little detail of the city with that in their brains. If you look at the larger, let's say, at the larger performance of that image, they would have seen a kind of, we might say artistic, they would very likely think theatrical representation of all of those verities that I've just talked about. And I say theatrical because there are so many moments in the Christian calendar of this period when there are literal processions, public theatrical events, plays on piazzas. They're called sacred representations a lot of the times. The ones that are organized by confraternities, there's another of their purposes, are called sacre rappresentazioni. So you will have examples of the lives of saints, of particular episodes from the Bible. One of the most famous in the Carmelite Church in Florence is the ascent of Jesus into heaven, where the church is packed out as local actors, children playing angels, somebody who's pleased as Punch because he's been elected to play the role of Jesus, raised on extraordinarily ingenious stage properties and machineries into the cavernous spaces of the church, rising up above the audience. They're used to these spectacular performances. In a more humdrum sense, these ideas fill their brains as they go about their daily business. They regularly attend church. Mass is another one of those theatrical performances that reinforces the sense of where they belong in the sacred hierarchy. I was going to make one other point when I was talking about the city of stone and the city of flesh. If this is the bit that's difficult for us to understand, even for, I think, religious people in this period, secular and sacred are not separate in this period. We tend to think secular means the non-religious day part of our lives. Maybe we live in a very secular society in Australia. Monday to Saturday, these are secular days when the populace at large doesn't think about religion. If they go to church, it's very often on a Sunday. Now, instantly people who are serious Christians will object to that idea because they believe that they enact the lessons of their religious teachings every day. I understand that. The society is not organised that way. Our society is organised very much in a profane sort of arrangement whereby God is certainly not included in everyday politics and everyday economics and so on. That is just inconceivable in this period. Secular, saeculum, in this period doesn't mean non-religious. It means earthly or worldly. And the worldly is contained within a Christian frame of reference. Everything is suffused with religious significance.
And so just going back to the way you began by walking us into this, into the loggia from the Piazza Duomo, and then to the image, what we see is a painting on a wall representing something, but then what a contemporary would have seen walking in is partly a reflection of the world behind them as they've walked into the building. Quite literally, they can see it's a continuation, I suppose, inside and out of a world that is both, as you're saying, a city of stone, but also a city of flesh, and that they would see the city of flesh. They would see the spiritual city, whereas we look at it as something. We look at the city as a material object to be navigated. So it's a very kind of complex image. And yes, I love the way you've brought out the different elements and shown an image that could be passed over this is a Madonna standing over a city. It's slightly strange or exotic. I think it's great how you've been able to show us the social networks, the relationships, how people understood themselves to live in the 14th century and 15th centuries.
You've been listening to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.